You believe you understand your emotions because you can name them, but naming a storm does not mean you control the weather inside you. You think emotional intelligence is calmness, patience, and maturity, yet you still feel irritated, defensive, jealous, and misunderstood in moments you cannot explain. There is a gap between what you think you feel and what is actually happening beneath your awareness, and this gap quietly controls your reactions. You have mistaken emotional reactions for emotional understanding, and this confusion has shaped your relationships, your arguments, your regrets, and your silent resentments. What if emotional intelligence is not about managing feelings, but about discovering something uncomfortable about the one who is feeling them? Because what you are about to see will make you question whether you have ever truly understood your own emotions at all. Imagine a person who speaks calmly during disagreements, who believes they are composed and rational, yet their chest tightens and their thoughts race unnoticed beneath polite words. Picture someone who walks away from arguments proudly, convinced they avoided drama, while replaying the conversation repeatedly later with irritation they pretend not to feel. Imagine a person who smiles in conversations, nods politely, listens attentively, yet feels secretly offended by small remarks they claim did not matter at all. These people believe they are in control of their emotions because nothing dramatic happens externally, because they do not shout, because they do not lose visible composure. They measure emotional control by outward behavior, not realizing the true storm happens internally where no one else is watching, where reactions are silently rehearsed and preserved. The mind creates a convincing illusion that silence, politeness, and delayed reactions are signs of emotional mastery, when they are often signs of emotional suppression. You begin to notice that emotional control is often confused with emotional avoidance, and the difference between the two is rarely questioned by anyone. Avoidance feels peaceful in the moment, because it postpones discomfort, because it protects identity, because it allows you to feel like the reasonable one. But what is avoided does not disappear. It stores itself quietly, shaping future reactions, future judgments, and future misunderstandings without your conscious permission. This is where the illusion becomes powerful, because you believe you are choosing your reactions, when in reality you are delaying reactions already decided beneath awareness. Emotional intelligence is often mistaken for emotional quietness, when sometimes the quietest people are simply the most emotionally crowded inside. You start to realize that the problem is not emotional intensity, but emotional invisibility, feelings happening without being fully observed or understood. And once you see this, you begin to suspect that your emotional life has been happening automatically for years, while you believed you were in charge. This realization is uncomfortable, because it suggests that your sense of control over your emotions might be incomplete, and what comes next makes it even more unsettling. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Imagine a person who believes they are calm during conflict, yet notices their chest tightens, their jaw clenches, and their thoughts loop uncontrollably despite outward composure. They smile politely, nod occasionally, and respond thoughtfully. Yet inside, irritation builds silently, weighing on attention, clouding memory, and influencing every unspoken judgment they make. This is the first crack, where the illusion of control starts to fracture, revealing that emotions operate beneath conscious awareness. Shaping perception before reasoning can intervene, the unsettling truth emerges quietly. That being emotionally intelligent is not about suppressing reactions. It is about noticing reactions before they shape behavior without permission. Every subtle reaction, every fleeting irritation, every unacknowledged envy or fear begins to expose the hidden mechanisms of the mind you believed were under control. The mind often confuses observation with understanding, believing that noticing an emotion is the same as mastering it, when mastery requires something far deeper and less visible. Even small triggers reveal the fragility of emotional control, showing how quickly unconscious patterns can influence decisions, judgments, and the tone of interactions without your awareness. This first crack exposes the gap between perceived and actual emotional intelligence, and you begin to sense that self-awareness may not be as complete as imagined. And once the crack forms, you begin to see the subtle threads connecting emotion, identity, and reaction, revealing why mastery is more elusive than you thought. The more you observe, the more you notice emotional patterns repeating unconsciously, showing that intelligence without reflection is often just the appearance of control. And this leads directly into the next stage, where past conditioning begins to explain why emotions react automatically, quietly shaping who you have become. Picture a child growing up in a household where emotions are dismissed or ridiculed, learning quickly that expressing anger, fear, or sadness attracts criticism or discomfort. Imagine a teenager who notices that certain reactions create tension, withdrawal, or ridicule from peers, and begins modulating responses to avoid pain while internalizing every subtle judgment. The brain encodes these early experiences into neural patterns, associating some emotions with risk, others with safety, forming automatic responses that occur before conscious thought emerges. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it over time. These learned patterns shape emotional perception, creating a filter where some feelings are allowed expression while others are suppressed or reinterpreted to maintain survival. Emotional reactions become rehearsed internally, sometimes for decades, creating an invisible map that guides behavior automatically in relationships, conversations, and personal reflection. Without conscious input, the nervous system becomes conditioned to anticipate outcomes, activating protective or suppressive behaviors long before the conscious mind realizes what is happening. Even subtle social cues trigger deeply ingrained responses, reminding the brain of patterns encoded in early experiences, shaping both reaction and interpretation simultaneously. This conditioning explains why emotions often feel uncontrollable or automatic, and why self-perception rarely aligns with actual internal processes, leaving awareness incomplete without deliberate reflection. It also explains why moments of emotional insight feel profound and transformative, because they disrupt long-established neural pathways and reveal hidden conditioning previously unnoticed. And once these patterns are recognized, the brain begins to allow observation of emotion rather than automatic reaction, opening the possibility for deeper understanding. This is why emotional intelligence is less about doing and more about noticing, a quiet, persistent awareness that transforms perception from the inside out. And this recognition sets the stage for uncovering the hidden payoffs that have kept these patterns alive and resistant to change. Emotional patterns are not random. They carry hidden payoffs that feel invisible, rewards that the mind unconsciously seeks to preserve, protect, and repeat over time without conscious permission. Suppressing anger, avoiding fear, or silencing sadness creates a subtle relief, a temporary escape from conflict, judgment, or discomfort, allowing the mind to feel safe and competent. Even avoidance has its rewards, because the brain notices reduced tension, fewer confrontations, and a sense of internal order when emotions are carefully managed or ignored. This hidden payoff reinforces patterns, making them automatic, comfortable, and difficult to disrupt, because the unconscious mind associates emotional suppression with security, acceptance, and reduced risk. You begin to notice how often emotional restraint feels rewarding, even when it conflicts with authentic expression, creating an internal tension between instinct and perceived safety. The payoff is not always conscious, but it guides decisions, responses, and interactions, shaping identity subtly while convincing the individual that self-control equals mastery. Over time, these rewards make emotional patterns habitual, creating a cycle where emotions are moderated, delayed, or redirected to maintain mental equilibrium, social acceptance, and internal comfort. Even moments of genuine emotional release are complicated because the mind evaluates them against the stability provided by suppression, often producing regret, guilt, or second-guessing immediately afterwards. The hidden payoff demonstrates why patterns persist despite conscious desire for change, showing that emotional intelligence involves more than skill. It involves recognizing the rewards keeping patterns alive, and once you see this, the challenge becomes clear. Emotional intelligence is not just noticing emotions, it is understanding the invisible incentives that shape them. This awareness leads to the next layer, where silence, restraint, and learned habits become not just strategies, But defining elements of identity, imagine a person who begins to define themselves as the calm one, believing their value comes from composure, observation, and measured responses in emotionally charged situations. Picture someone whose friends and family consistently label them as mature, stable, and reasonable, reinforcing the belief that silence, control, and emotional suppression are integral to who they are over time. Restraint becomes identity, an internalized script that defines self-worth, guiding interactions and decisions even when the original context no longer applies. This identity feels safe because it justifies avoidance, rewards stability, and prevents exposure to discomfort, conflict, or vulnerability, convincing the person that emotional quietness equals competence. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The identity trap is powerful because deviation feels threatening, uncomfortable, or even wrong, producing anxiety when emotions push toward expression outside the accepted internal script. The quiet, controlled self becomes the lens through which all interactions are filtered, shaping judgment, perception, and behavior long before conscious thought can intervene. This identity is both protective and restrictive, allowing mastery of appearance while limiting genuine engagement with feelings, relationships, and opportunities for growth. It reinforces emotional patterns established in childhood or adolescence, transforming learned strategies into seemingly immutable traits, shaping how every moment is experienced internally. And once this identity solidifies, the challenge is no longer learning to notice emotions, but untangling deeply ingrained narratives that define who you believe yourself to be, which leads to the next stage, where a shift in perspective allows these patterns, payoffs, and identities to be seen in a radically different light. What if emotional intelligence is not about controlling emotions, but about observing them as phenomena, noticing how they arise, move, and influence thought without judgment? What if every irritation, fear, or fleeting sadness is not a flaw to fix, but information about patterns, triggers, and vulnerabilities that have guided behavior silently for years? You begin to see reactions as signals, not instructions, revealing the unconscious scripts that have shaped relationships, decisions, and perceptions. Without your awareness, emotional patterns lose their grip when framed as observation rather than obligation, when noticing replaces reacting, and curiosity replaces judgment about what you should feel. The loudness of anger, the heaviness of fear, the ache of sadness. These are not enemies. They are data, revealing what has been learned, reinforced, and rewarded. This perspective shifts the focus from mastery to understanding, from performance to awareness, from pretending control to witnessing experience unfolding moment by moment. Every interaction becomes a study of cause and effect, of trigger and response, of perception and energy, rather than a test of competence or self-worth. And with this shift, the desire to suppress, avoid, or overcorrect diminishes, leaving space for insight, reflection, and a calm presence in emotional storms. The reframe does not eliminate emotion, but transforms it into clarity, revealing patterns that once seemed automatic, involuntary, or overwhelming into information that can be consciously interpreted. And once this lens is applied, emotional intelligence is no longer a goal to achieve, but a constant practice of noticing, integrating, and understanding what is happening inside. You begin to realize that intelligence lies not in control, but in perception, not in action, but in witnessing, and not in absence of emotion, but in presence of awareness. This prepares you for the next stage, where calm reflection consolidates the insight into lived experience, turning understanding into embodied awareness. After embracing this perspective, you notice internal reactions soften, subtle urges to defend, justify, or react impulsively fade into calm observation and measured awareness. You sense that your attention can linger on feelings without being consumed by them, allowing clarity where previously distraction, overwhelm, or impulsivity dominated. Your breathing, posture, and focus align with perception rather than reaction, creating a subtle, persistent equilibrium that stabilizes thought, behavior, and interpersonal interaction simultaneously. The quiet shift does not suppress emotion. It contains it within awareness, providing space for insight without triggering habitual automatic responses. that once shaped behavior unconsciously, you begin observing interactions differently, noticing how patterns of expectation, projection, and unconscious habit influence both your responses and the dynamics unfolding around you. This shift is cumulative, each moment of conscious observation reinforcing internal calm, clarity, and the ability to act without being acted upon by emotion. You feel a subtle expansion of mental space, where observation precedes reaction and reflection replaces impulse, allowing thought and feeling to coexist without conflict. And as awareness grows, emotional intelligence becomes less about acquiring skills or techniques and more about embodying presence, noticing patterns, and perceiving the hidden currents of experience. The quiet shift consolidates earlier insights, transforming intellectual understanding into lived experience and preparing the mind for the final mirror, where reflection reveals the full scope of self, which leads into the next stage, where you confront not just behavior, but the deeper truths about identity, emotion, and awareness. You begin to see yourself not as a set of behaviors, but as a living system of perception, feeling, and reaction, constantly interacting with the world. And your mind reflection reveals that every emotional response, every impulse to judge or defend, is a signal pointing toward patterns formed long before conscious choice emerged. You notice how often internal narratives have guided your decisions, shaped relationships, and influenced self-perception, creating a consistent story about who you are and how you must act. The final mirror shows that emotional intelligence is not mastery over feelings, but mastery of observation, understanding the interplay between stimulus, reaction, and internal interpretation. You see how unconscious patterns have reinforced identity, rewarded suppression, and hidden awareness, and how noticing them brings clarity without demanding immediate action or change. Every reaction becomes a subject of reflection rather than a threat, a chance to study yourself in motion and witness the hidden forces shaping thought and behavior. You realize that silence, patience, and measured responses are not evidence of control, but evidence of observation, and that real power lies in awareness, not performance. The mirror also shows subtle blind spots, areas where emotion and perception remain automatic, untouched by conscious reflection, reminding you that growth is ongoing and never complete. And once this reflection settles, emotional intelligence transforms from a concept into lived experience, where awareness, observation, and insight guide action rather than fear or habit. Because the final mirror does not judge, it only illuminates, leaving a quiet understanding that intelligence lies in noticing, integrating, and embracing the totality of inner experience. Next time you encounter emotional turbulence, notice the patterns, sensations, and impulses before they drive reactions, and observe how awareness itself transforms experience. Silently, you may begin to sense the distinction between reaction and observation, realizing that emotions are not enemies, but data, and that noticing them is a form of power. Silence, reflection, and observation become tools not for avoidance, but for understanding, allowing each moment to reveal the structures of feeling and the patterns that shape thought. You may discover that emotional intelligence is less a skill to acquire and more a constant practice of awareness, integration, and conscious perception in daily life. Each interaction, conflict, or fleeting irritation becomes an opportunity to witness your own mind in motion, noticing where patterns repeat and where conscious insight intervenes. And once this practice is internalized, your relationship to emotion changes quietly, subtly, and permanently, leaving less reactivity and more perception, insight, and reflective presence. So the question is not how to control your emotions, but how to notice them fully, seeing what has always been present but rarely observed. And the final thought lingers softly. What if intelligence is not measured by action, but by the depth and clarity of quiet awareness within every moment?